Greetings from Tokyo. I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Wrath. This week, you and I are going to paint a Space Wolves combat patrol. Let's go. Thanks for joining me in the studio. This week, you and I are going to continue our monthly Combat Patrol challenge by tackling the Space Wolves Combat Patrol. But first, I want to talk very briefly about Akihabara. Now, I know I've talked briefly about Akihabara in a video before, but given that there's so much to take in there, it bears repeating. If you are into any sort of nerd culture, that is your Graceland. If you are into any sort of hobby, whether that's model trains, RC cars, video games, miniature painting, manga and anime collecting, Gundam model kits, anything you can imagine, all the way up to and including the strangest and most niche hobbies in all of the world. And yes, of course, every 20 feet there is a maid cafe. Now, while that's really not my thing, I do travel to Akihabara often because within that district is some of the best modeling and painting shops in all of the world, and you can find a million different unique tools designed specifically for the hobby and massive paint ranges from all over the world, including Pro Acryl, Vallejo, Army Painter, and of course Games Workshop. Let's talk a little bit about the Space Wolves Combat Patrol. Now, I have always wanted a Space Wolves army, but when I first got into the hobby, my good friend Aaron, who actually got me into the hobby, was running Space Wolves, and it was always sort of weird to have the same army as your buddy. And while he collected Space Wolves, I collected Ultramarines and just sort of sat there seething with quiet jealousy over the incredible models in that range. Now that the Primaris Marines have come along, I don't want a Space Wolves army because they don't look like Space Wolves. Now, say what you will about the scaling and sculpting of some of those older Firstborn miniatures, there's no denying that each faction had their own unique flavor. Between the specialized units in the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels and the incredible sculpts within the Space Wolves, they were easily identifiable. Even if the armies weren't painted their unique colors, you could still tell the sculpts apart. And with the Primaris Marines, honestly, Games Workshop has dropped the ball. I know that they came out with these upgrade sprues for Primaris Marines, but as we'll see in the video, it's a really sad effort. And when you look at the cover of the box for something like the Combat Patrol, the only reason they look kinda like Space Wolves is that they're painted that iconic light blue. There are no pelts or necklaces full of teeth or flowing manes of hair or giant frost weapons of any kind. But thanks to Greytide Studios, this week's sponsor, who's just released the Primal Hounds pack, you can take your bland and vanilla Primaris Marines and turn them into incredible Space Vikings. We're also going to make some changes to the Invictor Warsuit. So let me show you how I took a very bland Space Wolves Combat Patrol and cranked it up to 11 on the Space Viking scale. Now, while the kit is nowhere near as massive as the Orcs Combat Patrol or the Tyranids Combat Patrol, there is still a ton of plastic in here. Having never painted Space Wolves, we want to find our recipe for that iconic blue, and we're going to start with the Reivers. The first thing we're going to do to make them more Space Wolfy is cut the iconography off of the chest plate. Now I'm just going to use a pair of single-sided nippers here to get the bulk of it, then I'll clean it up with a really sharp X-Acto. And then I'm going to finish it using these flexible sanding pads that I found at the hobby shop. These are actually really great. And included in the kit are these two Primaris Space Wolf upgrade sprues. This is where GW really dropped the ball. I mean, if you look at the detail here, there's plenty of shoulder pads, but not much else. There's a couple foxtails, one or two heads, and a necklace. Here is the Reiver arm drawing the knife, and here is the special Space Wolf hood. Can you spot the difference? But thankfully, this week's sponsor, Greytide Studios, has created the Primal Hounds pack, which includes over 300 different bits for your miniatures, including heads, power packs, weapons, shields, pauldrons, decorations, Terminator arms. The pack even includes these really great Reiver pauldrons, which we're about to use, and these really cool backpacks that look perfect for a light and mobile force. So of course, I loaded up my print bed and set that to work. Once those were all printed out, I attached them to the miniatures using super glue, and already we're looking more like Space Wolves. The combination of different parts and something as simple as just changing out the pauldron or the power pack really changes the look of the model. Once I've got that all set, I'm going to go ahead and prime the model. Of course, here I'm using Vallejo Black Primer through the airbrush. This is a really great primer. You can also brush it on and it gives an incredible finish. Now we're going to do a zenithal highlight. Here I'm using a white primer along the top edges and then a white paint on the pauldrons and the top of the power pack. We want a really strong punch here because for our first technique, we're just going to use some contrast paint. This is Contrast Space Wolves Gray, and I've seen this used to great effect over Wraithbone spray and other things. In fact, it almost looks like black magic. Now, I've watched a lot of tutorials online on how to best paint power armor using this, and the trick is to go panel by panel. And when it was all dry, I ended up with something like this. Now, this isn't a bad result, and I can see why a lot of first-time hobbyists are drawn to this. It has settled into the recesses, brought out all of our details, but it hasn't stained the surface as much as I'd like. So what we're going to do here is do a dry brush of Fenrisian Gray, and that's going to cover all of our panels but leave the details in the recesses. When that's set, I'm going to go through and on all my soft seals like the joints, I use this really great sort of bluish purple gray from Vallejo called Shadow Gray, and then I use Basilicanum Contrast over that to bring out the details. Now, if you've watched the channel for any amount of time, you know I have a love affair with Leadbelcher. It is my absolute favorite paint. It covers in a single coat, and it just gives this fantastic appearance. For the leather, we're going to use this recipe that I stumbled across about a year ago. We're going to lay down a sand or khaki color here, and then we're going to use Contrast Wildwood over top of that. Then, using the Basilicanum Gray, we'll go through and shade all of our metallic parts, and we're left with this. Now, I'm actually pretty pleased with the way this turned out. I've gone back and touched up the knee pads with the airbrush, but when you look at the unpainted model, well, there really isn't much of a difference. I kind of realized that they looked more like white scars than Space Wolves. It was much too subtle. So we're going to switch up the recipe, take a second shot at it. Here I'm going to apply some of that Shadow Gray on the underside, and then I'll airbrush Fenrisian Gray over the top. Now we're going to go back with that Space Wolves Gray contrast and apply that all over the model. Again, we're going to go panel by panel to try and control it to keep it from over-pooling, but we're actually using it a little bit more like a wash in this case. Once it was dry, I had something like this, and it's still splotchy, so we're going to take that Fenrisian Gray, do a heavy dry brush over the entire model. That's going to cover our panels, keep all the details in the recesses, and you can see it's a little darker, but still not there. So we're going to add a little spice. Electric Blue by Vallejo Game Color. Now, this is too potent to put in by itself, so we're going to mix it 5-to-1. 5 parts Fenrisian Gray, 1 part Electric Blue, and we're going to spray that from the top down. Then we're going to apply our Space Wolves Gray contrast, and as you can see, much too punchy at this point, too powder or sky blue. But no problem. Again, we're going to go back in with that Fenrisian Gray dry brush, really heavily apply that over the panels of the model, and boom, we finally have it. It's darker, it's more saturated, but not overly blue. With our formula all set, it was time to finish the rest of the Reivers up and move on to the Intercessors. And again, we're going to shave all of the Aquillas and markings off of the chest armor to make them look more Space Wolfy. I love these flexible sanding pads. They clean up the surface without marring any of the details. The models all went together without any problems, and the kit's actually really great. These greaves actually snap on in place, and it's very satisfying. We're going to go ahead and assemble the arms, and again, because we printed off a massive amount of these bits, we're just going to start selecting these really great pauldrons. The selection here is really incredible, and the guys over at Greytide Studios have done a great job. I am going to keep the Primaris power packs because I really like the look of them, but for the Sergeant here, there's a really great power pack with these ornamental wolf heads, and I'm really excited to paint this one up. Now that we've got our recipe down, we're going to apply that across the rest of the models here. Shadow Gray underneath, then that combination, again, 5 parts Fenrisian Gray, 1 part Electric Blue over the top. Now you'll notice here that the contrast paint is flowing more smoothly over this. I realized I should have been cutting it with contrast medium. So this is 1 part Space Wolves Gray and 1 part contrast medium, and you'll see that it just flows perfectly over the model, doesn't overpool. And then of course, we'll dry brush it afterwards to get our Fenrisian Gray back on the panels. Now I got overexcited and glued on all the pauldrons and then remembered that I have to paint them yellow, and painting yellow with a brush is an absolute nightmare, and it's much easier to airbrush, so I had to mask off all 15 pauldrons and paint them that way. Now I want to show you guys a panel lining trick that I stumbled across. I want to apply a little bit of water along the recess and then just a drop of the shade, and the capillary action will carry it across, give you a perfect panel line without a lot of spreading that you sometimes get with washes. Now it's time to move on to the weathering and chipping. This is a technique called sponge chipping. It's sort of stolen directly from the scale model hobby. Just tear off a piece of sponge. Maybe you've got one in a carry case, or maybe you have an old sink sponge. Put in a pair of tweezers, dip it into some umber paint. Then you just tap it along any of the high points in the model where the armor might have ground against something or gotten chipped or banged up. It's easy to overdo this, so just, take it sparingly. Now, the battle markings on the Space Wolf Company is on the right knee, and I've painted it red here, and then I've gone through and painstakingly used a 000 brush to paint these markings on all 10 of the Intercessors' knees. This one looks really bad, and it's the best one that I did. Honestly, I just don't have the ability to do detail work like this. I don't have a steady enough hand, so they are what they are. I'm going to move my way around the model here. I've decided none of the models will have any gold on them. They're all going to have a bronze, sort of keeping with that Viking theme. So I'm using a couple different bronzes here, and I'm going to wash them with a combination of Agrex Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade to give sort of a patinaed look. When that's dry, I'll do a quick highlight with Canoptic Alloy. Now you might have noticed that there's no heads on the models. I always paint my heads separately, and in this case, it's Greytide Studios to the rescue. Inside the Primal Hounds pack are over 30 different heads, helmeted heads, bear heads, and these really great Reaver heads. They have skull masks like Reivers, but they're wolf skulls. So I printed a ton of these out, and I love doing this trick. I take an old sprue, I take some hot glue, and I just pop the heads on there. It allows me to batch paint them all together, and then they pop off really easily at the end to be glued onto the model. Here, I'm just using some Kislev Flesh, and then some light flesh tone from Vallejo and a Zenithal, and then Reichland Flesh Shade into the recesses. And then I'll go through and hit some highlights again with that light flesh tone. When the heads are all done, I pop them off, and because they're resin, we use a little super glue, attach them, and while we're doing that, we just complete our Reivers, and we're going to pop them off of their temporary bases. Now, what are we going to do with 15 models with no bases? Well, again, inside the Primal Hounds pack are these amazing base toppers. They all have these Celtic and runic symbols in them. So I loaded up my print plate, printed all those out, and then super glued them to the 32mm bases. And then I just set about really quickly painting them. We want to make sure that we have a color neutral composition here. I don't want to take any attention away from the models and the blue of the power armor. So if we use a neutral color here, like these darker grays, that's going to allow the blue of the armor to have a little more visual impact. And once I've got those on, we're going to brush in some Nuln Oil that's going to sink into the recesses and bring out the details. Let that dry, and then we'll just dry brush some lighter grays on top of that to bring out the high points. And then Valhalla Blizzard, I absolutely love this stuff. I discovered it last year when I was working on my Leagues of O10, so we'll put that into the recesses. And because these are resin bases and plastic models, we use a little super glue to attach them. And with our rank and file done, it's time to move on to the captain. Because he is a Space Wolf specific model and not from a generic kit like the Intercessors or the Reivers, he is the wolfiest of the bunch and has pelts and a couple other things, but we can make him wolfier, and here's a great example. Come on, GW, a single rune on a power axe? No. So I found this really great frost axe in the Primal Hounds pack. Now the right pauldron is molded in, so I had to carve that away. I have this really great bit with a wolf's head on it that is perfect, another pauldron that has a lot of battle damage, and this really great power pack. We attach the axe and some decorations on the greaves, and what was already a wolfy model is 10 times wolfier. Now we've got our recipe down, we'll go through here, and of course I got overexcited and glued the pauldron on and had to mask that off. When doing the wolf pelts, I found a really great technique. What you do is lay down sand or khaki Then you're going to want to apply a wash of Agrax Earthshade. And while that's still wet, you want to brush on some contrast wildwood down the center. Wolves are often darker along the tops of their pelts. White with a drop of electric blue to paint the ice blade, and when that is dry, we're going to dry brush it. I know I didn't line it up for the camera there. I wasn't paying attention. Sorry about that. We'll pop it off the base and then using super glue, attach it to one of the resin base toppers that we've prepared. And it's time to move on to the final model in the Combat Patrol, the Invictor Warsuit. Let's talk about the Invictor Warsuit. It's dumb. Okay, there's no two ways around it. The guy is already wearing power armor and he's in a suit of power armor. It's in the toy design community what we would call a hat on a hat. It's such a bad idea. Now, having built my first Redemptor Dreadnought over the summer, link in the corner there, I took a few learnings into this. The legs on these models are overly complicated. They're such a huge hassle to put together. Fortunately, with some effort, I was able to get a really good striding pose here. Now, the upper torso went together without any problems until I hit this. The hand, I don't know why these aren't pegged. I could not figure for the life of me how to get those to fit in there. Eventually, I just had to use a ton of plastic glue. One of our first changes to the model is going to be this. I felt that the chest-mounted guns were too long, so I've snipped them back and shortened the barrels, and we come to this. Again, such a bad idea, and it just looks goofy. If you like it, that's cool, fine. I don't. Fortunately, while trolling cults, I found this. It's specifically designed to turn it into something more like a dreadnought, and as it turns out, in the Primal Hound's pack is this really great set of Space Wolves themed armor to go on a Redemptor Dreadnought, and they even include a scale for how much you need to change the size of the parts to fit the Invictor Warsuit. So I went ahead and prepped those, printed them out, and glued them to the model. Now, unfortunately, the way I glued the gun arm, the pauldron just didn't work with it. This would work normally on the Redemptor Dreadnought. But I remember there are these really great shields in the Primal Hounds pack, specifically this one with the horns and the skull on it. And there is the option to print them with or without hands. So I did that and glued it to the right pauldron, which gave me another idea. I went back into the pack and found a power axe. And again, there are options with and without hands. I printed it without hands, glued it to the front armor panels, and then I modeled this bracket and printed that out as well so that it could be attached to the front. With our model fully assembled, we moved on to the priming phase. Again, here, that really great Vallejo primer through the airbrush. It's going to cover all the different resin and plastic parts, unify the look. I'm not going to say it, lead belcher, it's the best paint in the world. I'm going to go ahead and apply that in a single coat over the model. Then I'll do a wash with Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. Once that dries, dry brush the model, go ahead and mask off the parts that we've completed, and then airbrush the body panels. I've done that already on the upper torso here, gotten everything neat and tidy, start final assembly. I've left some of these larger armor panels off because it's just easier to paint them that way and then assemble them separately. Saves a little time and effort. With that all done, we're going to go ahead and apply some shading. I've just put contrast Space Wolves Gray into the airbrush here, no mixer, and then just applying that along the bottom edge of the panels, and using an old airbrusher's trick here, just a piece of paper to quickly mask to get sort of an angle differential there. And then you've got to go through and painstakingly wash every rivet, crease, and panel line on the model. This took me a couple hours, but it's important for the detail. Once that's done, we're going to edge highlight. Here I'm using a frost blue from Vallejo, and then just running the side of my brush along the edges of the surfaces to bring out the highlights. From there, we just need to move on to some of the details on the model, like all these lenses and lamps, and then we'll move on to the bronze parts. Here, again, from the Greytide Studios pack, this really great sort of giant, I don't know what you call it, fang piece. It fit really well on the front of this. We'll go ahead and shade that with a little contrast wildwood. Move on to the axe that we mounted to the front here, contrast wildwood on the leather straps. Then we'll wash it with that combination of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. Then bring out some details with a little lead belcher when that's all dry. Gonna move on to that shield that we mounted to the right pauldron. Here I'm just gonna put down a brown and then our bronzes. Again, remember thematically, we don't want any true golds here. We want to work in these bronzes. So I'll put down Warp Lock Bronze. And then for the bone, I'm just going to apply Ushabti Bone all over here. And then we'll wash with Agrax Earthshade. You'll notice I'm not applying it to the skulls here. I'm actually going to use contrast skeleton horde on those, and contrast blood angels on the ropes here for a little punch of color. We have that on the right knee of the model, so we're going to carry that through in a couple other places. Once that's all set, we'll glue that to the arm, move on to the left shoulder pauldron. This is one with a really giant pelt on it. We're just going to do the same thing here that we did on the captain's pelt. We're going to lay down a khaki, we're going to dry brush to bring out our highlights, and then we'll do Agrax Earthshade wash, and while that's wet, we'll do a wash of contrast wildwood over some select areas. Then we'll just go through and finish the skull like we did on the other one, paint some of the bronze bangles and other things. With that done, it's time to move on to the sponge chipping. Same way we did it on the infantry. Here we're just getting some burnt umber on a sponge, going through and very sparingly applying it to any of the high points on the model that might take damage, just be scraped against things, or get banged up in the course of combat. With our two halves done, it's time to put them together. I'm going to use Tamiya Thin. It sets really fast, and then I'll apply my decals. And to finish the model, you guessed it, in the Primal Hounds pack, there's this really great 90mm base topper. And there you have it, one incredibly wolfy combat patrol. My special thanks to Greytide Studios for sponsoring the video and providing me with the STL pack that allowed me to turn some very bland and vanilla Primaris Marines into real Space Vikings. Well, I hope you liked the video. It was my genuine pleasure to make and share it with you. If you'd like to support the channel, please like, comment, and subscribe. Drive us to the front of YouTube and help us grow our audience. We are pushing 5,000 subs, and that would be an amazing milestone for January, and you can help out. And of course, you can always check out our Patreon, linked in the description below. Joining the Patreon at any level grants you access to our private Discord server, where like-minded hobbyists share honest and kind feedback to help you grow. And I share sneak previews of upcoming projects, and you can vote on future videos. Well, thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.